Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some of your questions, and we've got a couple over Twitter this week. The first one from Alan Park, who asks, what are the odds that there will actually be a new Minister of National Defence when Cabinet is announced? I'm not convinced that he, meaning Harjit Sajjan, won't stay in place. And also, who would be best to take over defence? Um, yeah, this is one of these kinds of things where it's certainly something we need to watch for because Sajjan is someone who really does need to go. Um, he's someone, and we've had this conversation before, that has not been doing his job in terms of keeping the Chief of Defense Staff really under control and ensuring that he's doing the work necessary for things like combating the scourge of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Forces. And that's something that, it's one of the reasons why Sajjan is basically needs to go. The Prime Minister has a good opportunity to make that happen now. It's not going to look like it's punishing him for something, even though he kind of deserves it. But in terms of, the small p politics around it, it kind of gives him a good opportunity. Sajjan's been in the role for 6 years, which is a very long time. So it is a really good opportunity for this to happen. On the other hand, they've really been defending him in the position and saying things like, he's not part of the old boys club, so he's well placed. But again, we should not have former military officers in the role of Minister of Defense because they are part of that culture, and that's part of the problem. They are blind to some of the problems that are in the department, particularly around things like that culture of toxic masculinity and, I think Justice Deschamps called it a highly sexualized culture, which targets women and LGBT people and so on. Sajjan shouldn't be in there anymore. There is obviously a chance that Trudeau will keep him in there, but on the off chance he's not, this is the opportunity to change. In terms of who, that's a very good question. I've been trying to think about that a lot, and I haven't had too many thoughts in terms of who could be, because building a cabinet is such a difficult task in terms of trying to find regional and gender balance and so on and so on. But there is also a lot of talk right now that perhaps it's time for another woman to be the Minister of Defense, being the only one we've ever had was Kim Campbell back in 1993, right before she became Prime Minister. So it's kind of that, it's overdue, but at the same time, you also get the possible dynamic that this could be a glass cliff where you're sending in a woman to fix a broken department, a broken system, and basically setting her up to fail. So that's another dynamic we need to consider. If it is a woman, two names have been suggested in the media, which would be either Anita Anand or Carla Qualtrough. Both are really good performing ministers, and I think that's something that's to their credit in this kind of a situation, where you want someone who's got a good handle on files. Anand was a law professor going into politics and one of the top experts in the country on corporate governance. So there's possibly some kind of crossover skills that she could bring over to that. She did a very good job in terms of procurement over the course of the pandemic. Carla Qualtrough one of her strengths is her candor and her ability to be frank on issues. And I think that's really important in the kind of transformation that needs to happen within the forces. So there's another possibility there as well. Previously, Professor Steve Seidemann and I had been talking about this, and his choice would have been Catherine McKenna, but she obviously didn't run again. So that avenue is now closed. But those are kind of some of the names that have been floated around. We'll have to see. I'm not familiar with all of the new MPs that have been elected, so there may be a name in there that I'm missing at this point. But yeah, it's something that we are definitely keeping an eye on. Our second question comes from Brendan, who asks, what are the barriers to a national or coalition government? Certainly at the federal level, barriers are largely just seat math and politics, obviously, but we've never really had a reasonable opportunity for one on the federal scene, because anytime that there's a hung parliament, usually the seat math is enough that the opposition parties, or the governing party rather, can work out some kind of a solution with opposition parties for long enough to keep things going. The seat math has never been marginal enough where it makes sense to have a national coalition, because coalitions involve having those opposition members in cabinet. And that's much more difficult to achieve because they have their own agendas. Enforcing cabinet solidarity is going to be a much more difficult task because they have their own agenda, because they are concerned about point scoring, things like that. So that's a consideration that needs to be in there. We had the possibility with the prorogation crisis in 2008, but there wasn't enough stability in what was being proposed, and that fell apart shortly thereafter, which is kind of an indication about why it really wasn't why it wasn't something that was really a serious consideration. If it had been serious, it could have survived that prorogation. They could have voted non-confidence on the throne speech as soon as it came out, as soon as it happened in the spring, and gone ahead with that coalition, but it didn't. So that's kind of where things are at. There just has not been sufficient impetus for one. And I know there's this kind of narrative that, it would be great if we could have a coalition, because then you'd have more parties on side and more cooperation and so on and so on. But it's also a lot of horse trading, and it's a lot of making particular deals to make this happen. And that I think is harder to achieve in practice than it is in theory, because different parties have their own agendas and goals and so on. And I think there was also a bit of a cautionary tale in what happened in the UK when the Liberal Democrats joined in with the Conservatives to oust the Labour Party after that one election. And after that 4-year period, the Lib Dems got wiped out. They were basically, punished by their voters for going into this coalition in the first place. And so, as a party, they have not recovered since. So I think that's also a cautionary tale for parties who might be contemplating that in Canada. In terms of being afraid that if they do enter into this, that their voters will not be happy because of the compromises that they have to make, and if they have to prop up a party that they don't particularly like, and then kind of punish them for doing that. So those are kind of considerations that are, you know, very real in politics, and why, if there is not an immediate impetus that, you know, to prop up a government, that it does not make sense for them to do so. You know, there were periods in Canada's history where it did make more sense, somewhat around World War I, but I mean, there were periods where there were precarious seat counts and small upstart parties who were able to kind of cobble together agreements with the major parties at the time. But again, also in terms of how our political system works, the parties themselves, the big tent parties, are coalitions within themselves. So it's not the same as it would be for other countries where you've got a lot of smaller parties who are forming a coalition in order to make a government work. You know, the big tents are coalitions within themselves and are kind of making that work internally in order for them to kind of, you know, form a government. So those are all kind of considerations, but yeah, when it comes down to it, there just hasn't been a mathematical necessity for doing so, and for the most of the past century. So that's kind of where we're at. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.